The subcommittee will come to order due to time restraints of Ambassador Satterfield, and we're so honored to have you here. Not that we're not honored to have you here, Mr. Ferguson, but thank you very much. We will get started. Mr. Deutsch is at a judiciary meeting, and as soon as he is done with that, he will come right back, and we will recognize him for his opening statement at that moment. I will after my opening statement, and any members who have an opening statement, we will hear from our witnesses, and without objection, the witnesses' prepared statements will be made a part of the record, and members may have 5 days to insert statements and questions for the record subject to the length limitation in the rules. The chair now recognizes herself. This is now the 6th time that Ted and I have convened this particular hearing, conducting oversight over the President's budget request. It is often difficult to know if the request matches the objective because we are often presented with broad or generic. Because we're often presented with broad or generic policy objectives rather than strategies to achieve those objectives. I'm going to do the low voice. And this year's budget request for the Middle East and North Africa, sadly, is no different. Earlier this year, then Secretary of State Tillerson laid out the administration's vision for Syria. I don't think many of us would disagree that it did have 5 laudable objectives. Likewise, just a few weeks ago, Secretary Pompeo laid out 12 objectives in our counter-Iran plan. But I think it's safe to say that both of these were policy objective heavy and short on strategy. That is to say, they were lacking details on how we were going to accomplish those objectives. This makes it extremely difficult for us as policymakers and members tasked with an oversight responsibility to ensure taxpayer dollars are used effectively and efficiently to really know if the administration is requesting adequate resources to carry out its strategy. It's also difficult for us to get a full accounting of the support we provide to the Middle East and North Africa, given that many different mechanisms and accounts are being used to provide our assistance to conflict areas and humanitarian crises in the region. In Iraq, in Syria, in Jordan, and in Yemen, there is a great need for U.S. leadership and U.S. assistance. These are old threats, but there are new threats and there are emerging threats that can destabilize the region and damage our interests as well. But this budget request seems like it does not go far enough to match the priority and the threat to our national security with the resources allocated. In Syria, the budget request seems to fall short of Tillerson's stated objectives. And that's before you take into account the fact that the administration has put a hold on $200 million for Syria stabilization efforts until it completes a review. I'm all for getting partner nations to increase their share of contributions, but in the meantime, we're losing critical time and we're certainly not making progress on our Syria objectives if we aren't providing our assistance. Likewise, I remain very concerned over our continued request for assistance to the Lebanese Armed Forces, the LAF, despite very real concerns regarding Hezbollah's influence. $50 million in this year's request. With Hezbollah and its allies making gains in last month's election, it doesn't make sense to continue to push the narrative that we are supporting the LAF as a counterweight to Hezbollah. Instead of having used our assistance for Lebanon wisely with programs aimed at decreasing Iran and Hezbollah's influence before the elections, our embassy in Lebanon cut critical programs, perhaps out of fear of upsetting the status quo. And because of that, we will certainly need the administration's request for $3.3 billion in foreign military financing for Israel, as it faces an increased and more aggressive Iranian posture on its borders and many of these other emerging threats. So I applaud the administration for standing strong with Israel and in understanding the sheer magnitude of the threats that our closest friend and partner, the Democratic Jewish State of Israel, faces. I do, however, question the administration's decision to keep the PLO office open. I've been trying to get an answer on the status of the PLO office ever since November, when the waiver lapsed, which should have forced it to be closed. I spoke briefly with Ambassador Satterfield about this just yesterday, but Congress and the American public deserve to know why the administration is allowing the PLO office to remain open. I joined Senator Cruz in sending a letter to the Secretary laying out specific questions, and it is my hope that we get a full public response. There's no reason why the administration should keep this information to itself. Moving to Jordan, I applaud the administration for meeting the agreed number that is stipulated by our latest Memorandum of Understanding, MOU. The numbers reflect the need to ensure that Jordan remains stable and secure. However, I do hope that the administration sees the current situation on the ground in Jordan as seriously as we do and understands that it may need to be flexible with its resources if circumstances dictate. And we look forward to His Majesty coming to meet with us very soon. I was also pleased to see the administration reverse course from last year's request and allocate additional funds for Tunisia. $95 million for fiscal year 19 represents a $40 million increase from FY18 requests, but falls far short of what's required and far short of what Congress has appropriated. Tunisia's stability and Tunisia's success are of vital importance to the United States and the region. Failing to ensure its viability would be a terrible mistake. We want to work with the administration to advance our interests in the region, to ensure that we have an adequate response to the ongoing crises, and to ensure that the region's stability and security. So I am eager to hear from our witnesses on ways that we can work together to achieve all of that. And with that, I'm pleased to yield to our ranking member, Mr. Deutsch.
Thank you, Madam. Thank you, Madam Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Satterfield and Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator Ferguson, for appearing today. The work of the State Department and USAID is incredibly important. I'm very grateful to all of our Foreign Service and career personnel at both agencies. We ask a lot from these people, often sending them to far away and very dangerous places. We ask them to do their job, often without the full resources that they need. And it's important for us, for this Congress, to communicate to them how grateful we are for their service, and we ask that you relay that right back to them. As we look at today's Middle East, the challenges we face are only growing more complex. These growing threats and challenges emphasize the need for the United States to develop and stay committed to a comprehensive strategy backed by an adequate level of funding so U.S. interests and stability in the region can be advanced. I remain very concerned about both the administration's lack of a real whole-of-government cohesive plan for the Middle East, as well as the proposed cuts to the international affairs budget. For the second year in a row, the administration has sent us a budget with a 30% cut to a portion of the budget that makes up less than 1% of our total spending. Again, against the advice of bipartisan military leaders, bipartisan diplomats, and bipartisan elected and former officials. These cuts undermine our ability to promote democracy, diplomacy, peace, and security, and development in this key region. These cuts also send complicated messages to our allies who look to the United States for leadership. Our partners want to know they can count on us not to retreat from the region, and that the United States will live up to its commitments. Our traditional allies are questioning where we stand following our exit from the Paris Climate Accord, JCPOA, and the harsh criticism of our closest partners. But we need to work together to confront regional threats and to ensure our own interests are protected. And I cannot overstate how deeply concerned I am that this administration continues to disparage and create unnecessary and petty conflicts with our allies. Iran is actively and aggressively spreading its malign influence throughout the region. There is no doubt that it is in our national interest to counter Iran's dangerous expansion, including in Yemen, Lebanon, Iraq, and Syria. Yet, apart from exiting the nuclear deal and reimposing sanctions, the administration has not provided specifics on how we're going to confront the Iranian threat. Also seemingly lacking a strategy for how we're going to tackle long-term problems like what our role in the Syria conflict will be after ISIS is pushed from its remaining territory in the east. Will the United States continue to back the Syrian Democratic Forces, who've been an instrumental ally in our fight against ISIS? And if so, to what extent is the administration willing to back them if they come into conflict with Turkish or pro-regime forces? And I remain deeply concerned about the freeze on our assistance to the Syrian crisis. We've got to continue to support democratic transitions, particularly in North Africa, and I'm pleased to see FMF restored to Tunisia, although not quite at levels necessary to confront the many security challenges. Even as we try to assist with security and stability in North Africa, we must remind all governments that human rights cannot be trampled in the name of security. The United States should continue to support economic development and civil society, as both are the cornerstones to open and democratic societies. We're also watching as the administration struggles to articulate its plan for peace, and peace talks between Israel and the Palestinians seem to be even further out of reach. Now, I supported the decision to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel because it is the capital of Israel. But Hamas is trying to take advantage, trying to use this decision to end the humanitarian crisis in Gaza to sow discontent. Now, I worry about the decision to cut humanitarian funding and freeze other West Bank and Gaza funding. We can acknowledge the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and work with our allies to address it, even as we decry Hamas, as they focus not on that crisis or the people of Gaza, but instead on advancing their own terror agenda aimed at the civilian population of our ally Israel. We can do both. And Madam Chairman, there is much to discuss today. I haven't touched on the Gulf crisis, protests in Jordan, the conflict in Yemen or Libya, but I will stop here. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses on how the administration plans to work for U.S. national security interests on this deeply flawed budget proposal, and I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Deutsch. And now we'll yield to members who wish to make an opening statement, starting with our friend from New York, Mr. Donovan.
Thank you, Madam Chairwoman and Ranking Member. I want to thank you for holding this hearing today to ensure resources match objectives in the Middle East and Northern Africa. The number of crises that continue to plague the region is shocking. The Assad regime in Syria is still a U.S. designated state sponsor of terrorism. Assad brutalizes his own people through the use of chemical weapons and barrel bombs. The people in Gaza are suffering in the midst of clashes between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. Meanwhile, the Palestinian Authority could obtain the humanitarian and desperately needed for its people, if only they would stop making payouts to terrorists. Iran has developed a geographic land bridge across Iraq, Syria, and Lebanon to give itself a clear path straight to Israel. It's not just me and my fellow bipartisan members of the Foreign Affairs Committee who have identified these areas as matters of grave concern. President Trump has spoken on all of these issues as well. I am looking forward to hearing from the Trump administration witnesses today as to how the requested budget will conquer these problems to better serve American national security interests. And with that, Madam Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Donovan. Ms. Frankel, my Florida colleague.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And thank you to the witnesses for being here. A couple of issues. I'm especially concerned about the Syrian stabilization assistance. I look forward to some comments on that, and also the humanitarian conditions in Gaza, the violence by Hamas, and our response there. In particular, I want to bring to your attention, hopefully this has been brought to your attention, is what's going on in Saudi Arabia, which is very shortly going to lift the ban on female drivers, which is a good thing. And there has been a slow movement there to try to give, now women can actually go to movies. I mean, this is a biggie. But what happened recently was the arrest of women activists who were protesting or activating, trying to get more rights, more social rights for women, and they were arrested and accused by the the state news agency that they wanted to destabilize the kingdom and breach its social structure and mar the national consistency. I mean, which is really, I mean, basically, they're calling for an end. This is the women. They're calling for an end to Saudi Arabia's repressive guardianship system, which requires women to get the permission of a male guardian for almost everything. So it's shocking in this day and age. So it seems pretty obvious that this administration did not publicly condemn these arrests, and I am very curious as to whether or not behind the scenes what we are saying about this, if anything. And I yield back.
Thank you, Ms. Frankel. Mr. DeSantis, another Florida colleague. We own this subcommittee.
Well, thank you, Madam Chairman. We had a wonderful event last month in Jerusalem when we opened the American Embassy. It had been American policy since 1995, never implemented by a series of presidents. But when you talk about resources, a lot of the plans out of the State Department were to build something that was going to cost maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. It was going to take years and years. And to his great credit, the Ambassador David Friedman had a plan where we utilize an existing consulate annex, which I think is going to work very well. Minimal expenses to get it ready. And obviously there'll be some things we do over the years, but I think that was a great example of doing something with an eye on the taxpayer, and it ended up being a phenomenal event. As we look forward, certainly if you're looking at Syria policy, I don't know how we can look at what's going on in Syria and not want U.S. policy to recognize Israeli sovereignty over the Golan Heights. Under no circumstance would we want that strategic area to be turned over to some remnants running around Syria, whether Iranian or Hezbollah or Syrian affiliated with the Assad regime. So I'm hoping that that'll be the next step. The embassy was bold. Let's recognize Golan, and I think we'll help establish more security in the region as a result. And I yield back.
Thank you very much, Mr. DeSantis. Mr. Rohrabacher of California.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman, and thank you for the leadership that you provided all these years here on this committee. We appreciate that, and I'm sure that there are people overseas.
What do you want?
I'm sure there are people who are alive today and living peacefully today because of the great endeavors that you've made in this committee. Let me note I am optimistic about the Middle East, and we have a president who went to Saudi Arabia, and the first thing he did was far different than what his predecessor did. Predecessor bowed to the leadership of Saudi Arabia. Our president took the leaders and put them in a room and said, if you want to be a friend of the United States, drive the terrorists out of your mosque. And you know, our president has had more success than trying to promote what a good guy he is by bowing down. And in fact, we have a much greater chance for peace through that act of strength. In Iran, same deal in Iran, same deal when it comes to moving the embassy into Jerusalem. We have a president who's made tough decisions and been strong. It's going to bring about a more peaceful situation. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Rohrabacher. And now it is a pleasure to introduce our witnesses. We're delighted to welcome back our friend, Ambassador David Satterfield, the Acting Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs. Ambassador Satterfield previously served as the Director General of the Multinational Force and Observers. Prior to this, the ambassador served as coordinator for Iraq, senior advisor to the Secretary of State, Deputy Chief of Mission to Iraq, Chief of Mission in Cairo, and as the United States Ambassador to Lebanon. Thank you for your service, sir, and we look forward to your testimony. And next, we are delighted to welcome Mr. Halum Ferguson, who serves as Senior Deputy Assistant Administrator for USAID's Bureau for the Middle East. Prior to joining USAID, Mr. Ferguson worked for the International Republican Institute for 13 years. At IRI, Mr. Ferguson served as the Deputy Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa, and previously held positions in Afghanistan and Iraq. Thank you for being here today. We look forward to your testimony. And as I said, your entire testimony is part of the record. Please feel free to summarize, and we will begin with you, Mr. Satterfield.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, and while I don't want anything, I do associate myself with the remarks regarding your leadership of this body. Thank you very much, all of you, for inviting me to appear again to discuss the President's fiscal 19 budget request. As members of the subcommittee know well, there are many challenges facing this region. In order to meet these challenges, and I also am optimistic about the future of the region, the President has requested $7 billion in foreign assistance. This request addresses critical U.S. national security and economic interests with an emphasis on burden sharing. It focuses U.S. funding on the enduring defeat of ISIS, strengthening democratic institutions, and broadening the range of economic opportunities and civil participation available to citizens of the region, including women, minorities, and the growing number of youth in that region. President Trump has been very clear that the United States should not and will not bear the sole responsibility for funding regional stabilization. Excluding U.S. government contributions, our partners in the global coalition to defeat ISIS have contributed more than $3 billion in funding for explosive hazards clearance, bilateral stabilization support, and humanitarian assistance to Iraq since 2014. Additionally, coalition donors have contributed more than $540 million to the UN Development Agency's funding facility for stabilization, the FFS, which is implementing projects in liberated areas of Iraq. Now, civil conflict in Yemen and Libya make it difficult but not impossible for our assistance to reach those in need. Iran's malign behaviors, ongoing support to proxy militias, support for terrorist organizations, and development and proliferation of ballistic missiles destabilizes the region and threatens our partners. These are the challenges. But despite them, we have been persistent in our effort to mobilize regional and local partners, international partners, to join us in support and not have us and the U.S. taxpayer shoulder the burden here disproportionately. Following the President's decision on the JCPOA and through execution of our comprehensive Iran strategy, we have the opportunity to counter Iran's regional influence and enhance regional and U.S. security by building new partnerships, deepening existing relationships. With our allies and partners, we share a common assessment. I want to underscore, we are not going it alone here, that the Iranian regime poses a threat to our collective security, to international security, that we must address jointly and rapidly. Ranking Member, Madam Chairwoman, I know you are deeply concerned about the Robert Levinson case, and I want personally to assure you the administration remains committed to resolving this case, bringing home all Americans, whether in Iran or elsewhere, who are unjustly detained. President Trump has been clear. The enduring defeat of ISIS is one of his primary national security priorities. The 2019 budget request for the region supports this commitment with substantial foreign assistance to support key regional and local partners through civilian-led efforts to stabilize and secure areas liberated from ISIS and other terrorist groups. The 19 request for Syria recognizes the support necessary for the enduring defeat of ISIS to counter the influence of other terrorist groups. ISIS has lost nearly all the territory, the so-called caliphate, it once controlled in northern Syria, but the fight does continue as we meet. U.S. foreign assistance prioritizes stabilizing areas to cement military gains and facilitate the safe and voluntary return of those who have been displaced. The President has requested $200 million to support Iraq. Iraq is at a crucial juncture. It has the potential to be a center of stability and prosperity for the Middle East and a partner for the U.S. We are optimistic about the future of Iraq. In Yemen, we are working with the international donor community to address critical humanitarian needs and help create opportunities for durable peace. The 19 budget request includes $43.4 million to support the Yemeni people and their institutions to address development and security issues, particularly countering the threats in Yemen from ISIS and al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Now, the 19 budget request, of course, includes our enduring commitments to our key partners, Israel, Jordan, and Egypt. It also seeks development and security assistance funding for programs in the West Bank and Gaza. Madam Chairman, Ranking Member, the 19 request supports our highest national security priorities in the region. It promotes investments to further our regional interests, and it encourages support from others for a common burden and a common challenge. I want to thank you for the support this subcommittee has expressed. I look forward to answering your questions.
Thank you so much, Mr. Ambassador. Mr. Ferguson.
Chairman Ros-Lehtinen, Ranking Member Deutsch, and members of the subcommittee, thank you for the opportunity to testify on the President's fiscal year 2019 budget request for the Middle East and North Africa. And thank you for your leadership on this subcommittee. I am pleased to appear alongside Acting Assistant Secretary Satterfield. The Middle East and North Africa remains a key focus of U.S. foreign policy and national security priorities, particularly as we continue the fight against violent extremism. Despite complex political, humanitarian, and development challenges in the region, we see opportunities for USAID's work in stabilization, economic and social development, and protecting vulnerable communities. As you heard from Administrator Green in April, USAID's goal is to end the need for foreign assistance. There is no surer path to self-reliance than helping governments be more responsive to their citizens and more accountable in the management of public resources. To that end, the FY 2019 request will support democracy assistance programs that remain a fundamental element of how we help countries address critical development challenges. USAID stands in solidarity with the people of the Middle East and North Africa as they work to build a stable, more prosperous future. With your support, our FY 2019 request of $1.7 billion for economic and development programs will help secure the enduring defeat of ISIS, further strategic partnerships, promote good governance, and encourage stability and economic security. The impact of the Syrian crisis and ISIS has spread to neighboring regions and countries, especially Jordan. Jordan is host to more than 660,000 registered Syrian refugees who have a significant impact on host communities. With our FY 2019 request, we will continue to work with the health and education ministries to ensure that Jordanian communities, including refugees, have access to the same quality of services. Additionally, in support of our nearly 8-decade partnership with the Kingdom of Jordan, our FY 2019 assistance will help Jordan accelerate inclusive economic growth, improve delivery of public services, and promote more efficient management of scarce resources, including water. Our commitment to Jordan is evidenced by the new 5-year MOU we signed in February. In Tunisia, the birthplace of the Arab Spring, the USAID assistance will continue to work with local government structures, provide tangible economic and educational opportunities for youth, partner with private businesses to create jobs, and support sustainable economic reform. For example, we currently assist private companies in addressing the critical issues of unemployment and underemployment, particularly among young people. In Yemen, the humanitarian crisis continues to deteriorate in the absence of a lasting political solution, as we continue to see today. As a major donor, we are keenly aware of the importance of the humanitarian assistance and commercial goods, including food and fuel, which moves through the Hodeida port, and are determined to ensure they are not disrupted. As Secretary Pompeo reiterated earlier this week, we expect all parties to honor their commitment to work with the United Nations in support of a political process to resolve this conflict, ensure humanitarian access to the Yemeni people, and map a stable political future for Yemen. USAID is in the process of scaling up development assistance activities to help put the country on a path to recovery and create the conditions for lasting peace. More details about USAID's plans for specific areas are in my written statement for the record. Before I close, however, I would like to mention one
Would you like to put something in the record?
I'm sorry?
Did you say that you wanted to put something in there?
More details of our plans will be included in my written testimony that will be submitted. Thank you. However, before I close, I would like to mention one administration priority, the protection of religious and ethnic minorities who have suffered unspeakable harm in recent years, including genocide, crimes against humanity, and other atrocities. At the President and Vice President's direction, USAID is now redoubling its efforts to identify, deliver, and distribute the aid that Iraq's persecuted communities desperately need. Our commitment to these communities is steadfast. When minorities are attacked, we rally local and international civil society and the private sector to join us. We strive to ensure their safety, food security, and livelihoods, and to find them a place to call home for now and ultimately secure their return. We have already channeled tens of millions of dollars to the region, but we know the need is far greater and that we must do more to meet the urgent needs of these endangered populations, and we will. This month, Administrator Green will travel to Iraq to meet with leaders of these suffering communities to personally assure them that assistance will soon turn from an inconsistent trickle to a steady stream. With the FY 2019 request, USAID will continue its assistance to these vulnerable communities, particularly religious and ethnic minorities in the Nineveh Plains and Sinjar regions. Protecting people's rights to choose their own beliefs and culture has been at the core of our nation's values since its founding. I thank the subcommittee for its continued recognition of the importance of this work and for your steadfast support. Thank you for inviting me to testify today, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you to both gentlemen with us. Ambassador, I'll ask you a question, and then two for Mr. Ferguson. I'll just read them right along so you can ponder it. Ambassador Satterfield, in your written testimony, you state that security assistance to the LAF is the backbone of U.S. policy to reinforce Lebanon's sovereignty and the government's authority throughout the region. Yet last month, Secretary Pompeo told us at a full committee hearing that a review of U.S. assistance to the LAF is necessary in order to ensure that American tax dollars are supporting groups that can achieve U.S. interests. How do you reconcile these two statements? Is it in U.S. interest to have aid to the LAF be the backbone of our policy while that aid is under review, and what is the status of that review? And then for Mr. Ferguson, H.R. 5141, the United States-Israel Security Assistance Authorization Act, tag team effort by Mr. Deutsch and me, would authorize USAID to sign additional MOUs, Memorandums of Understanding with Israel, in order to advance our mutual international development goals. Is USAID working on this global MOU with Israel? And another bill from Ted and Ellie's excellent adventure, H.R. 2646, the United States-Jordan Defense Cooperation Extension Act, would authorize a Jordan Enterprise Fund, among other things. And given the kingdom's economic state, its current political unrest, vital interest to the United States, and given that Congress historically appropriates funds over the MOU numbers, will USAID take additional ESF funds to set up this enterprise fund? So we will begin with you, Mr. Ambassador.
Madam Chairman, the continued U.S. Robust support to the Lebanese armed forces.
Closer to your mic.
Trying to avoid feedback. The continued U.S. robust support to the Lebanese armed forces remains one of the critical elements of our efforts in Lebanon to achieve not just stability in that country, particularly in the south, but also to enhance the role of state institutions, particularly security institutions, against illegitimate pretenders to that role, notably Hezbollah. The Secretary's remarks spoke to the fact that we continuously review all of our programming, including this program, to ensure it remains both in its content, the amount of resources dedicated, and the outcomes, not just the inputs and outputs, advancing U.S. goals. We continue to believe at this point, that support does.
You don't think they're conflicting? You think
they're not
they're reviewing, but it's still
we always review these programs.
Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for your questions, both important subjects. First, thank you for the encouragement on exploring and negotiating a memorandum of understanding with Israel. We do share many of the same objectives in terms of development and providing prosperity around the world. And we are indeed pursuing such an MOU, and we hope to have an announcement to that effect in the very near future. Our administrator is personally very engaged in this and looks forward to speaking more about it. On the question of the Jordan Enterprise Fund, I traveled to Egypt a few weeks ago, during which I met with the Egypt American Enterprise Fund there and came away very impressed by the work that they do. and am very encouraged at the possibilities of applying that same model elsewhere. And in Jordan, I think it is an issue that we look forward to exploring very carefully and fully in partnership with you. Because, as you say, the economic needs in Jordan are great, and I believe an enterprise fund is part of the solution there. Thank you.
Good news. Thank you so much. Mr. Deutsch is recognized for his questions.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Ambassador Satterfield, first of all, I really want to thank you for your comments on Bob Levinson and the other Americans, and I do appreciate the commitment from you and from the Secretary. Bob remains the longest-held American hostage, and Secretary Pompeo in his Iran speech on May 22nd said the return of American citizens held in Iran is a priority. I wonder if you can provide any update on how the administration plans to engage with the Iranians and our allies to ensure the return of Bob and the other Americans.
Mr. Deutsch, I would be very happy, along with my colleagues, to provide that information to you in an appropriate setting.
Okay.
Very happy to arrange that.
I appreciate that. We will follow up to arrange that meeting.
Thank you.
Of course, Ms. Ferguson, welcome to the committee. Let me start by saying I have great respect for you, the work that you did before coming into this position, and your commitment to this position. But I'm still surprised, I think a lot of us are surprised to see you here today, as until 2 days ago there was a different senior deputy assistant administrator, and we were notified yesterday that you'd be here instead. And I just wanted to talk about, because there are questions and I'd like to just air them out, some of the circumstances that seem to coincide with the departure of your predecessor. I've followed the policy change directed by the White House in October to directly aid religious minorities in Iraq. You spoke about the importance of that this morning. I fully concur with your assessment of the importance for us to be vigilant. I'm aware that one of our colleagues wrote a piece last week criticizing USAID for slow walking in the delivery of that aid. And I now see that the Vice President, and as you referred to this morning, the Vice President has directed Administrator Green to personally go out to Iraq to evaluate the situation, a trip that I also understand had been long planned. My first question is whether you plan to make any changes in the funding to religious minorities in Iraq that has already been awarded.
Thank you for the question. Yes, this is a very important matter, as I mentioned in my opening remarks and as you were just discussing. We have a variety of assistance mechanisms and streams currently underway, including one that is reaching its conclusion of the procurement process right now. We expect that to be concluded sometime in the next coming weeks, and we do look forward to getting that assistance underway. In addition, I would add that we are exploring additional means for getting resources quickly and rapidly to these endangered communities through a variety of options.
As you complete that assessment, were entities, or do you expect any entities that have already been told that they won't receive contracts, who were asking for sole source contracts, and are there any plans to award sole source contracts in the broad agency announcement process?
I'm sorry that I can't get into complete specifics in terms of the ongoing broad agency announcement, as it is an ongoing procurement, and so we can't get into details of it. But there are a variety of organizations that we have been talking to over a long period of time that are involved in that, from faith-based communities to local Iraqi groups. And we're looking at a variety of consortiums and coalitions that will be funding through that.
As you look at those, there is speculation whether your predecessor, who I understand was a member of the senior executive service, was removed because she in some way refused to flout USAID's policies and procedures and provide contracts to groups that perhaps the Vice President and others wanted, or whether she was simply forced to take the fall for following USAID's established policies and procedures. And if those procedures, if there is any truth to that, those procedures need to change, that's a policy decision that I would think that we would be engaged in. Again, I'm just concerned about the message that this confusion, and maybe it will be sorted out with the announcement as a result of this process, But I'm concerned about the message that's sent to career civil servants to see someone who has spent their career working on behalf of state and USAID unceremoniously pushed out of a senior position with a political appointee, albeit qualified, political appointee installed in their place. I hope that this is just the start of this conversation. I think there is it's very important that this be addressed in a very open way so that we know exactly what the circumstances were. And again, if in fact there was what is believed to be the case actually happened, it's concerning, and I think would require this committee to engage in further discussion about the policies, whether they were appropriate or needed change, and whether this was ultimately a political decision made about someone who was following those existing policies. And with that, I yield back. Thanks, Madam Chair.
Thank you so much, Mr. Deutsch. Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thanks for your leadership in holding this hearing and a bunch of other nice stuff. So I'll just fill it in with whatever you want to hear. So thank you. I thank the panel for coming before us today. You know, when I ran for Congress in 2010, I'd actually gotten back from Iraq in 2009, and I had heard then the new president, President Obama, talk about repeatedly how he wants to leave Iraq. And in fact, at the end of 2011, he did just that, declared victory. He was correct in declaring a peaceful, stable, democratic Iraq, but we left Iraq, and we know what happened after that, and we're bearing the ramifications of that. And that's my concern with kind of where we're at today. I think in combating terrorism, we're going to find ourselves in a generational fight. I think we have arguably so far, and it's going to continue. And so my big concern is, how do we deprive the next generation of terrorists of recruits? That's the 7 and the 8, 9, 10-year-olds right now in refugee camps or living under oppressive hands. And that's the way to starve the next generation of their ability to recruit. Mr. Satterfield, I do have a question for you. It was reported that you proposed closing American forward operating bases on the Iraq-Syria border as an incentive to get Iranian-backed militias to withdraw from southern Syria. Can you explain your reasoning here?
Excuse me, Mr. Kinzinger, could you repeat the comment?
Yeah, it was reported that you proposed closing American FOBs on the Iraq-Syria border as a way to incentivize the Iranians to leave. If that's true, can you explain what your reasoning is for that?
The reports are not correct.
So they're just totally incorrect?
No, they're totally incorrect.
Okay.
Any decision on the presence of U.S. military in Syria, anywhere, would be contingent upon execution of the destruction of ISIS and our policy with respect to containing and rolling back the presence of Iran in Syria.
Okay, so just to be clear, at no point did you propose that as a incentive?
No, it's not correct.
Okay. And we had reports this weekend that Iranian-backed forces in Syria temporarily withdrew from the southern de-escalation zone only to return to their post wearing Syrian army uniforms. Do you think that the Iranian-backed militias could use a similar strategy in other parts of Syria should American forces withdraw from the region?
I have not seen those reports and, frankly, have seen nothing in any channel on such an allegation. Iran.
So I must be getting all kinds of information from somewhere that's incorrect then.
Iran and Iranian forces remain present throughout Syria. Our objective is to see them leave all of Syria, not just the southwest. In terms of how one would validate that, there are many ways and means to know whether any purported withdrawal of Iranian-backed proxy forces has or has not been achieved, not just in our hands, but in the hands of other critically involved parties in the region.
And do you believe that we can counter Iran in Syria while the Assad regime remains in power?
It's an excellent question that you pose. I see little indication that this regime is prepared to sever its reliance upon connections with Iran and the presence of Iranian forces in Syria. But the goal of that total Iranian departure from Syria is absolutely where we are.
And then last year, the Iran and Iraq desks at Bureau of Near East Affairs were merged into one position. Following President Trump withdrawing from the U.S. from the JCPOA, the Deputy Assistant Secretary who handles the issue has become extremely busy implementing the administration's policy towards Iran. This is concerning given the recent Iraqi elections. Yesterday, cleric al-Sadr, an Iranian-backed militia chief, Amiri, formed an alliance between their political blocs. While the formation of the government is not complete, this is an important development towards the Iranians gaining a strangle on the Iraqi government. I think it's important to remind people that a quarter of American soldiers that were killed in the war were killed directly or indirectly by Iranian influence and forces. What actions did State Department take to assist those Iraqi officials who were working to ensure Iraq became a pro-West democracy instead of a pawn to the Ayatollahs in Tehran?
Two comments. First, the process of negotiations, maneuvering, both public and private, between the various coalitions or would-be coalitions in Iraq is exceedingly complex. I would caution strongly on the record, nothing you hear or see in terms of declarations of formation are anything more than posturing for the moment directed at influencing other groups within Iraq. This is a process that still has some time to work its way out. In terms of our role, we are very much engaged and involved at all levels of government in working for an outcome which supports what we believe are both Iraqi and U.S. interests in stability, in an alignment that does not allow the domination of Iraq by any outside force, including Iran. We think the chances of getting there are good, but this is an Iraqi political process. It still's got quite a ways to play out.
Thank you. And I want to thank you for your service to your country, and thank you both for being here, and I'll yield back at that.
Thank you so much, Mr. Kinzinger. Mr. Schneider of Illinois.
Thank you, and as have others, I want to thank the chairman and the ranking member for having this hearing, and to my both colleagues from Florida, but the chairman, all the good wishes as you finish your term here. And again, thank you to the witnesses for joining us today. As you laid out your assessment, I try to think of the issues in our interests in the region in essentially three ranked categories. First is humanitarian. We have key humanitarian interests in Syria, in Yemen, the impact that that's having and potential crises leading to in Jordan and Lebanon. We have security interests. As you touched on, we need to defeat ISIS. And it's not just ISIS, because behind ISIS is al-Qaeda and other groups that are a threat to the region, but also to our interests around the world and here at home. And ultimately, we have long-term strategic interest. The biggest threat I see in the region continues to be Iran's nuclear program, Iran's interventions in conflicts in the region, trying to spur those conflicts and support of terrorism. As we look forward, we're trying to create this stability through diplomacy, stability through development, ultimately stability by creating political resilience within our allies in the region. But I have real concern. Ambassador Satterfield, you also touched on a key point that one of the challenges in the region is the growing number of youth. And I think all three of those interests are affected by the population and the demographics in the region because of the youth. So my first question to you is, how are we ensuring that our strategy, our investments in the region are focused on the long term and making sure that the youth have opportunities, have stable governments, and are not a breeding ground for these terrorist organizations?
Certainly. Mr. Schneider, I would say the three critical strategic lines you have outlined all have to proceed in parallel. No one in all places at all times can trump the others. With respect to the youth, let me look at the example which I think is probably most distinct of Egypt. Egypt has one of the highest rates of population increase in the world, and the rate of population increase grows year on year. The challenge posed by this youth cohort bulge, the inverted pyramid as it's sometimes referred to, is a challenge to the Egyptian government, it's a challenge to society, to economic opportunity, and to stability and security. What are we doing? We have shifted, and here I would turn to my AID colleague, over the course of the last decade, increasingly, to programs which are explicitly targeted in terms of demonstrable delivery to populations in Egypt who need to have the skills necessary, both of a technical, non-technical, and professional character, to be able to work to contribute to the growth of the Egyptian economy. That's a different approach than was taken in many years past. It's a shift away from bricks and mortar programs towards people and enhancing skills in a particular place at a particular time that are needed, but it's very much speaking to the kind of long-term goals that you've advocated. In Yemen, though, our focus is on simply providing feeding, potable water, medicine, to sustain a population in absolute humanitarian crisis.
Right. So, and I appreciate that, and there's so much to talk about. I want to I don't mean to gloss over it, but you also talked about burden sharing. I support efforts to increase the burden sharing. The United States cannot go it alone, but I would also posit that United States leadership is critically important, not just now, but in the long term. And I do hope that as we talk about burden sharing, it's not with an eye towards the United States withdrawing from the region, but working with our allies, working with our partners, bringing more resources to the region, but securing the United States' role. How do you see us ensuring and strengthening the U.S. position, the U.S. role in the region?
The President is absolutely committed to increasing burden sharing, both of a financial and a presence on ground character. But your remarks are absolutely correct. What we have found in our exchanges with regional, international, local parties is that a degree of U.S. engagement is necessary to elicit and sustain the much greater burden sharing by external partners that we seek.
Great. And I'll close, I'm running out of time, but I do worry very much about Iran's presence in the region, but in particular Syria, as they're increasingly developing permanent presence of their forces, indigenous missile manufacturing capability. And my broad question is, as the President has signaled a desire for U.S. withdrawal from Syria, what is the long-term implications for us ensuring that Iran does not create a permanent presence in Syria, threatening all of our neighbors in the region, but in particular our key ally, Israel?
We share exactly the concerns you identify in the words that you have used. We are working with all of our partners in the region, including Israel, on how best to mitigate, contain, and then roll back that threatening Iranian presence.
Okay, and I just would continue to raise the concern, if we are withdrawing from Syria, it's harder for us to have influence in the outcomes long-term and strategic in Syria. With that, I yield back. Thank you very much.
Chair recognizes the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Mast, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman. I appreciate it. You know, I think one of the things that's often missed by people in Washington, D.C. is failing to acknowledge that what our partners want, leaders of other nations, is they want what's best for themselves. They want what's best for their bottom line. That's a reality of the world that we live in, and I thank God personally that we have an administration that cares more about the young sergeant or the young lieutenant from a place like Paris, Arkansas, or Paris, Illinois, or the tax dollars of some constituent from a place like Paris, Indiana, or Paris, Iowa, than they do about the well-being of a bureaucrat in Paris, France. So I think that's something that needs to be applauded here. I have a question for each one of you. Number one, for you, Ambassador. When we talk about the conversation of burden sharing, and we look at those historical numbers, 540 million in Iraq, 3 billion, numbers for the future, 200 million, who can you say are going to be our top partners for burden sharing? What percentage of burden sharing do we expect out of them individually? And is that a reasonable expectation that they fulfill that?
We have already had key support from governments in the Gulf, Saudis, Emiratis, Qataris, from the broader international community outside the region, Japan, as well as European partners. I can't give you percentages because we don't express it that way. The requirements are considerable. We have identified the specific order of magnitude of those requirements, not just for broad categories like stabilization, preventing resurgence of ISIS and violent extremism, but particular project areas, streams of funding, where we believe international participation, regional and local participation is absolutely appropriate, and we continue to engage at the highest levels to elicit the support necessary to meet those goals. They're in the interests of the region itself, not just U.S. national interests.
Is that an expression that can be made in a more suitable environment?
We'd be happy to provide greater detail in an appropriate setting.
Thank you. Mr. Ferguson, I have a question for you. When we're talking about resources and burden sharing, are there resources that are being used to encourage those hundreds of thousands of Syrians who have fled Syria to share a piece of that burden by re-engaging in fighting for their own country?
Thank you, sir. The regional Syrian refugee crisis is a critical one, and we have spent over the course, since the beginning of the crisis, $7.4 billion of U.S. taxpayer money supporting those refugees throughout the region. The ambassador may have more to say on specific diplomatic initiatives to encourage those refugees to take a more direct role in the ongoing fighting there. USAID's primary concern and focus is ensuring that those people are healthy and comfortable in their current and their temporary residence, and ultimately, someday, we lay the groundwork for them to go home.
I thank you for those comments. Just to espouse on this a little bit, it's troubling to me, a piece of that, the focus on comfort for Syria, for refugees. I get it, I understand it, but I also get what I ask when I ask somebody to engage in combat. I know it as well as anybody, and I dare say one of the greatest parts about American history is the ways in which we've gone out there and fought and earned our freedom and earned the style of government that we want. And if Syria ever wants to be a nation where they can look back on themselves for generations to come, those refugees that have fled their country have to play the greatest role in reobtaining their country and making it into the nation that they want it to be. Otherwise, it's not going to be something that's long-lasting, in my opinion. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you again to our panelists. I want to go back. I think I raised my questions in earlier remarks, and I want to start with what's going on in Saudi Arabia, which I think we were all happy to hear about progress. I say it, the progress, it's ridiculous it's taken all these years, but so they're due to lift the ban on the female drivers, but just recently they have arrested women activists who have been protesting for greater reforms, which include women not having to get their father or their husband's permission to do many different activities. So my question to you is, what has the administration done in this regard? Is there anything? I know that there hasn't any been public denouncements, I don't think, but what about behind the scenes?
Ms. Frankel, the administration has strongly supported the Crown Prince's vision for what we would call a more liberalized society, which empowers the over 50% of the Saudi population that is female to play their role in the country's economy, society, and future. These are worthy goals. We have encouraged and supported the specific steps that have been taken so far, some of which you make reference to. While they may seem like small and extraordinarily late from a historical perspective measures, they are enormous in the context of Saudi Arabia's history, culture, and traditions. We understand and we speak to the Saudis regarding those issues which continue to concern us, including the question of arrests, which would appear to contradict the broader liberalizing ambitions that the Crown Prince and the government have laid out. And we're certainly not silent about those issues in our dialogue. But I do want to underscore, we regard the progress that has been articulated in aspirational sense by the Crown Prince as exceedingly positive, worthy of support.
So if you know, was there specific conversations about these recent arrests in regards to women being required to get permission of male guardians for almost everything? Were there specific discussions on that?
The issue of the arrests has been discussed.
Okay. Well,
I would just add, if I could,
yes, please.
That on the more general question of women's rights throughout the region, this is an issue that USAID takes extremely seriously and attempts to incorporate in its programs in every country. Not in Saudi Arabia per se, but in Tunisia, Egypt, everywhere we go. It's something that our administrator talks about all the time.
Oh, thank you very much. And I had another question that I posed, and I wanted to get your input on that, which is what we've seen been going on on the Gaza Strip, we know that obviously there are issues with humanitarian conditions in Gaza. On the other hand, some of this, the quote-unquote nonviolent protesting is not nonviolent, and it's instigated by Hamas paying people. What, if any, recent steps are we taking in that regards?
Mr. Frankel, we've made very clear, including during the events of May 14th, when I was in Jerusalem along with others, some from this committee and from the U.S. government, that the responsibility for the fatalities, for the injuries that occurred at and on the fence that day lies solely with Hamas. Hamas put innocent people in line of fire, put them at risk for its own cynical objectives. They and they alone are accountable for this, no one else.
I agree with you on that point, but my question is, are we taking any other steps to help? There are innocent people in Gaza who are suffering, and what steps are we taking?
We have robust, along with the international community, contributions of a humanitarian character to Gaza. We support efforts by the government of Israel as well as by the government of Egypt and others to relieve the humanitarian suffering. But my answer has to track back in the end to the fact much of that suffering is a direct consequence of actions taken by Hamas and what Hamas has not done. Recognized the existence of the State of Israel, accepted that only a peaceful political negotiating process can yield outcomes, and abandonment completely of the use and tools of violence.
Okay. Well, I think I'm, okay, yes. So I guess my follow-up to that is, aren't funds being frozen? Funds that are going towards humanitarian assistance, are they being frozen?
Humanitarian funds continue to flow. Previously obligated funds continue to move.
I'm sorry, if I can add to that
Yes.
answer. The review that is ongoing does cover all assistance going into the West Bank and Gaza. Previously obligated funds to humanitarian implementers, including the World Food Program, and other implementers continue to run. But to your point, ma'am, yes, those resources are on hold. No additional resources have been delivered at this time.
What is the extent of the assets that are not being delivered? What are we talking about?
I'm sorry, I don't have the specific numbers of specifically humanitarian resources in the Gaza Strip here. We can follow up with you with more direct detail.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Frankel.
Thank you.
Mr. Zeldin of New York. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And Ambassador Satterfield, I agree 100%. I appreciate your sentiment with regards to your analysis of Gaza and the cause of their struggles and the importance of supporting Israel's efforts, the administration's efforts to hold what is a terrorist organization accountable, and their need to recognize Israel's right to exist. I want to get clarity on, I just want to follow up briefly on Mr. Kinzinger's question. Did you propose, Ambassador Satterfield, did you propose closing a base on the Iraq-Syrian border?
There was no proposal to take any such step. We have been in detailed discussions with governments in the region, including that of Israel, on how best to address the situation in the southwest, as well as in Syria as a whole. But any decision on the U.S. military presence anywhere in Syria, A, is a presidential decision, B, depends absolutely on the exit of Iran from Syria.
And the reason why we're asking is that it was reported, you probably have seen some of the stories where your name was referenced as being in a meeting with some other nations involved in the region with regards to a proposal to close borders.
I'm not going to comment further on confidential diplomatic discussions, except
I just
to note
want you to understand why we're asking.
principles. Yes.
Okay. With regards to, going back to the topic on Gaza, West Bank, there's a next generation of children in schools being educated, receiving textbooks. some of which, many of which are provided from the Palestinian Authority. The PA does get funding support from UNRWA. The United States, provides a lot of funding to UNRWA. Some of those textbooks are English only. There are many members of Congress with concerns with regards to the content of these textbooks, showing maps of the Middle East without Israel, not teaching their children about Judaism, not just historical, geographical, religious. There's a whole perspective of reality that they're not providing to that next generation. And we do provide a lot of money to UNRWA, and that money, in large respects, end up in providing for funding these textbooks. So what is, either of you want to just share your perspective of what you're observing and what we can do to better leverage the money to get the results of filling in the gaps of what's not getting covered?
What you address here is a long-standing concern, whether from the PA or from UNRWA, the issue of incitement through educational materials. It's decades old. We have addressed this over a number of administrations. It is among the concerns that we have regarding both the PA as well as UNRWA itself. And when you make reference to the burden of UNRWA funding last year, calendar year, U.S. provided 34% of the funding to UNRWA. The President has made very clear that is an inappropriate burden on the United States in terms of the magnitude of the monies, but perhaps more importantly, the fundamental structures of UNRWA, from the budget model, such as it is, to the mission and mandate, require deep examination and consideration.
I appreciate that answer. I tend to agree that the oversight, the accountability, the auditing of how our funds are being used, the better leverage of the money that's being provided to get the results that we're looking for. Can you speak to, is there anything you can share with regards to the English-only supplement and how that might be filling in any gaps that we're not seeing otherwise?
I'd have to come back to you on that
Okay.
specific question.
Fair enough. There are English-only supplements that are provided to teachers, and I would encourage anyone involved in the process, whether it is the teacher, anyone responsible for supervising or hiring that teacher, to the PA, UNRWA, the entire chain of whether it's funding, drafting textbooks, approving curriculum, and the standards, is to ensure that some of those gaps get filled. If English-only supplements are being provided, I think it's important for the teachers to be using them. So there's a lot here that goes beyond just accountability, auditing, better leveraging our money. We can fund the material, we can make sure it gets into the teachers' hands. It's important that the teachers are actually using it, and it's not just getting shelved and they're not participating in training. And I would look forward to any future opportunities to work with either of you gentlemen on getting better results with our funding and filling in those gaps in the region. Thank you. I yield back.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zeldin. Mr. Cicilline of Rhode Island.
Ambassador Satterfield, I want to go back to the issue of the Palestinians. I want to be very clear about this. Are you saying that all funding is frozen to the Palestinians, both UNRWA funding and other funding?
Already obligated humanitarian assistance, what remains in those channels, continues to flow through implementers. New assistance is frozen.
So when you say new assistance, money that was allocated for 2018 has been frozen?
All previously appropriated funds, other than those obligated for humanitarian
Previously
purposes.
appropriated or previously obligated?
Previously appropriated.
Okay, because we have reports from UNRWA that they are running a $260 million deficit because of frozen funds. Food from the World Food Program will end at the end of the month, leaving 350,000 people without food. You agree with that assessment?
I cannot comment on those numbers.
Okay. That 700 schools will close that provide education to 270,000 students, and that Hamas has offered to open the 700 schools, which means those young people will be exposed to the worst kind of extremism possible. So you would agree that, well, let me ask this. You can't dispute those facts because you don't have knowledge of it?
On the issue of education, I can indeed comment.
That 700 schools will close?
By end of July, we understand from UNRWA that contracting will need to be entered into for the August startup of schools which they support. We have sought from UNRWA a definition of what the order of magnitude of the fiscal gap here may be. With respect to an assertion that Hamas possesses the resources to open UNRWA-funded schools in Gaza, I simply can't comment.
Okay. So what is the status of the review of UNRWA funding? Who's conducting it? What's the current status? What are the data points in making a determination who's doing it? This seems to be generating a significant humanitarian crisis that could undermine rather than advance the national security interests of our own country and Israel. So
The review is underway.
By whom?
The National Security Council is leading the interagency community in that review. It will make recommendations ultimately to the President.
And when is that expected to be concluded?
I cannot give you a timeline, sir.
Ambassador Satterfield, how does the administration's budget and policy goals reflect its position on Egypt's crackdown on personal freedom, civil liberty, and non-governmental agencies, which I consider to be very, very serious?
We are sensitive to, have discussed with the government of Egypt the impact of what you described, civil society restrictions, other steps the government and its authorities have taken on overall long-term stability and security of Egypt. At the same time, we regard Egypt as a vital, critical pillar of security and stability, not just for the region, but also for Europe and for the United States. And our dialogue with Egypt touches on both those issues, the vital national security role, U.S. definition, Egypt plays, as well as our concerns over the matters of civil society, freedom of speech and activity.
Ambassador Satterfield, finally, you in response to Congressman Frankel's question about the plight of women in Saudi Arabia, spoke a little bit about the department's budget and policy objectives, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on how the budget request, which very significantly cuts funding for diplomacy and programs that would impact the rights and well-being of women and girls, helps to achieve the mandate of the State Department's Office of Global Women's Issues, which represents the aim of the United States to promote interests such as ending gender-based violence and child marriage, advancing women's economic empowerment, and promoting women's active roles in peace and security, which seem hard to achieve those objectives with deep cuts in programs that fund efforts that are intended to enhance the rights and well-being of women and girls. I'd like to know how you reconcile those.
With respect to Saudi Arabia?
No, broadly.
Broadly speaking, we believe we have the resources required to continue with the active promotion of those goals.
And finally, so the deep cuts, I mean, it's a curious answer. We made a substantial investment in these programs to achieve that objective. We have deep cuts, and you think we can still achieve them, but I take your answer. My last question then, Ambassador Satterfield, is what is the status of the $200 million marked for the Syrian stabilization fund? I know it's been on hold. What's the current status of it?
Continues to be subject to review.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Cicilline. Ambassador Wagner of Missouri.
I thank you, Madam Chairwoman, for hosting this hearing, and thank you to our witnesses for their service. I appreciate the subcommittee's commitment to our duty as members of Congress to examine how the U.S. is allocating its finite resources to confront a range of threats in the Middle East. Mr. Ferguson, in 2016, USAID used $20 million from the Complex Crises Fund to mitigate the strain that an influx of Syrian refugees imposed on Jordan's water resources. Can you explain and evaluate how USAID implemented this money?
Yes, much of USAID's approach to supporting Jordan, a critical ally, is indeed to alleviate the pressures placed on local communities by the refugees. And the number that I referenced earlier, over $7 billion spent throughout the region, a large portion of that is in Jordan, not just through the specific allocation that you're referring to.
How would you evaluate that quickly?
So on that specific instance, I will have to return to you with more detail. I'm not intimately familiar with that specific.
I'm very interested in the fund and vis-a-vis my genocide and atrocities legislation and how it's being used by state and how we can better use it in the future going forward, especially in the areas of prevention. To that point, Mr. Ferguson, the administration has indicated that it can use the Economic Support Fund to support crisis response activities that Congress funds through the Complex Crisis Fund. In your experience, how has the Economic Support Fund been used to respond to anticipated humanitarian crises in the Middle East, and is the Economic Support Fund the most efficient way to fund regional crisis response?
We use economic support funds for a variety of programs throughout the region, and as it intersects with crises, as we see many in the Middle East, the ESF funds are primarily used to attempt to alleviate the longer-term underlying drivers of those crises. So in Yemen, for example, a terrible humanitarian crisis, we are using ESF funds primarily to address the long-term drivers in terms of state collapse there, to prevent the much more immediate humanitarian issues.
And immediate humanitarian issues would become under the refugees and what happened, for instance, with the Syrian refugees in Jordan and such. You know, I do want us to make sure that we're communicating with the administration the difference between the Complex Crises Fund and the ESF. The ESF being, as you well stated, Mr. Ferguson, a longer-term look to crisis mitigation in the Middle East and across the globe. I was appalled and, to be honest, deeply confused to learn that Syria took the reins of the UN Disarmament Forum at the beginning of this month. As we all know, Syria's proliferation activities in chemical weapons, ballistic and cruise missiles, and likely biological weapons are well documented. Ambassador Satterfield, how will the State Department counter mixed messaging from the UN and roll back the development of banned weapons in its Syria programming?
Were extremely involved prior to that assumption by Syria of that position, and we made public very vigorously in the voice of our mission in New York our outrage at that step. It is wholly incompatible with the objectives of that organization.
I couldn't agree more. I also am, like I said, appalled and find it abhorrent that Syria could take the reins of the UN Disarmament Forum.
We share that view.
Any further discussion regarding this, or a reevaluation or a revisit on this?
It will not impact the international work to identify and hold accountable the Syrian regime for abuses which it undertakes.
According to the United Nations, North Korea has been supplying Syria's chemical weapons program. What impact will our new negotiations with North Korea have on non-proliferation issues in the Middle East, do you think?
I will have to take that question. We'll respond to you.
I would appreciate that, especially since we are all focused on the Korean Peninsula right now, and obviously non-proliferation issues as a whole. So I thank you, and I yield back the remainder of my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from New York, Mr. Swazi, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Satterfield, thank you so much for being here today. A lot of questions have just been asked about Syria, and I just want to follow up on some of those questions as well. I'm concerned about that we don't have a strategy overall, or we don't know what the strategy is regarding Syria. I supported the President's decision to launch the airstrikes in Syria in response to the chemical attacks by the Assad regime. But I'm concerned about knowing what the comprehensive strategy is. And by not having a comprehensive strategy, we're really empowering Russia and Iran in the process. So in response to my colleague, Mr. Cicilline, you said earlier that the $200 million stabilization fund is on hold and still under review. So what's being reviewed? What's the decision points regarding that money? And I'll let you answer that first.
The President has made clear we wish to destroy as rapidly as possible the remaining presence of ISIS in Syria, the so-called caliphate, and that process is well underway as we are speaking. The President has also made clear in parallel that the burden of preventing the resurgence post-destruction of ISIS, of either ISIS or another violent extremist group in Syria, lies primarily with regional and local forces who are most directly affected by that phenomenon. This is a question both of financial support, but also literal physical support for stabilization, for continuing the mission. We engage with all of the states in the region towards accomplishment of those two objectives by the President.
Okay, so now you say the President's been clear, but the President's also sent some signals that the U.S. forces may be withdrawn from Syria. So is that a possibility? Is there a timeline for that? Is that being discussed? And how does that line up with our goals, similar to what you just mentioned, about the effect to try and limit Iranian forces in Syria and to limit Russia's influence in Syria?
The President remains instructing us to continue the ISIS campaign and to continue to solicit the greatest degree of support possible from regional, local, and international parties for the enduring, ongoing mission after that defeat.
So are you saying that right now there's no consideration of withdrawing Syrian American forces from Syria?
I have described the President's position as best I can.
Okay, and when you talk about the regional forces, are you talking about an Arab coalition in northern Syria, and how will that affect our relationship with Turkey in the process?
We are looking at regional and local forces to take on their share of responsibility for stabilization in northern Syria post-defeat of ISIS. We have a very robust dialogue with the government of Turkey on issues in northern Syria that are of particular concern to the Turkish government, and we don't see the two as contradictory.
What, if you could, would you say should we be looking at over the next 6 months? What are we looking at? What are the big decision points over the next 6 months?
Destruction of ISIS.
So that's the only number one priority.
It is the number one priority.
And is there any other priority related to Iran and Russia at this time?
We obviously are extensively engaged in our Iran strategy with effecting Iran's ability to sustain its malign behaviors in the region and beyond, to be able to resume an enrichment program, and to continue with the broad range of actions which the U.S. regards as fundamentally threatening to us, to our friends and allies, to the international community. That is a key policy focus of the United States.
So how does that manifest itself specifically in Syria? How does our concerns about Iran manifest itself in Syria?
We are in discussion, and greater detail can be provided in an appropriate setting with key involved parties in and around Syria with respect to how best to roll back the Iranian threat posed by, presence in, and through Syria.
Okay, thank you. I yield back my time.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Rohrbacher, for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you to our witnesses. Let me just note the expression that we heard earlier of the compassion, tears of compassion about the humanitarian situation on Gaza. Let me just note that as long as those the leaders in Gaza are allowing their resources to be spent on tunnels that go into Israel in order to put terrorists into Israel, as long as they are allowing rockets to be shot into Israel. Those tunnels, I have visited them. They're very expensive, and those rockets certainly are not inexpensive. We should not be in any way concerned that we're shortchanging humanitarian needs for governmental or leaders of a given area that spend their money on rockets and tunnels. So with that said, where do the Kurds fit into all of this? Could this not be, I happen to believe the turmoil we face in the Middle East is not due to Israel, but is due to the fact that 100 years ago that the Western colonial powers decided to create countries out of nothing, like the country of Iraq that supposedly exists. Isn't it time that maybe we try to set things straight, maybe permit the Kurds and other nationalities there, like the Baluch in Iran? Shouldn't we try to, in some way, deal with that instability that was created so long ago?
Mr. Rohrabacher, we could spend a great deal of time on the issue of Sykes-Picot and where it is 100 years later. But our position, our policy is quite clear. We support Syria. We support Iraq. We support Iran as integral united states within their existing borders. We believe that is a correct position based exactly on the issue of stability, vice instability, security, vice insecurity.
I understand that, and I certainly commend the professionalism that answer reflected, but let me just note, I don't think that works. And I think that we have seen it's not working, and perhaps we should pick our friends and just say the Kurds are our friends, and let's see what we can do to help them whether or not whatever that creates in the among the make-believe country of Iraq would be less relevant than having the Kurds as a force in that part of the world. Now, Turkey, could you give us do you think Turkey will be playing any kind of a positive role, or are we worried that Erdogan is going in exactly the wrong direction?
I can speak to our engagement with Turkey with respect to Syria. There we have been engaged over the last many months to try to achieve a resolution, an aspirational plan dependent on conditions on the ground, in which Turkish concerns, which are real and we respect, with regard to terrorism and attacks on and across their southern border with Syria, are properly addressed, as well as our concern that stability in Syria be sustained and that our campaign to defeat ISIS not be interrupted, as was the case some months ago. With respect to the hypothetical you pose on the broader issue of direction to Turkish policy, my colleagues from the European Bureau can respond in greater detail, but I can simply tell you, we regard Turkey as a critical NATO ally, as a part of Europe. We wish to see Turkey advance and prosper within those frameworks.
I understand that's a great, again, more professional approach. Perhaps the more revolutionary approach might end up with a better result, which is the approach that I'm suggesting. Let me note that when you're talking about partners and that this administration is looking for partners, I would hope that when we look at Iran, we look for partners there, but not in the government, not in the established order, but the fact that you have people in Iran who are our allies. There are more Kurds in Iran than there are in Iraq. We've got Azaris in Iran and Baluch in Iran and young Iranians. So if we're looking for people to share the burden and we're looking for partners, I hope that we look for those people inside Iran who are willing to be our partners, and they're anxious to do so. Thank you very much again. We appreciate your service, both of you, and we appreciate the professionalism that you reflect, and we'll try to get the job done as partners with you. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from California, Mr. Liu, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you, Ambassador Satterfield, for your service and for being here today. I'd like to talk to you about Yemen. In April of this year, you testified before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and I'll quote what you said. You said, "I will be quite explicit. We have told the Emiratis and the Saudis there has to be no action undertaken that could threaten the port of Hodeidah." Right now, UAE is launching a military offensive on Hodeidah. The reason that you said what you said, and the reason the administration took that position, I believe, was threefold. First, the UN itself stated that such an operation could result in 250,000 civilian casualties. Second, a prolonged assault on Yemen's main port would severely jeopardize the delivery of humanitarian aid to the whole country, making what is already the world's humanitarian crisis somehow even worse. And third, it would instantly set back any progress that's been made to reach a diplomatic solution to this seemingly endless conflict. So my first question to you is, what has changed since your April statement and today?
Mr. Liu, we continue to expect all parties to this conflict to honor their commitments to work with the United Nations and support a political process, not a military process, to resolve this conflict and to ensure the critical goal of continued humanitarian access. We're a major donor of humanitarian aid, and we are very concerned with the situation of the Yemeni people. We are keenly aware, as we've spoken to in the past, and as the Secretary of State has spoken in the past, of the importance of Hodeidah and Salif ports, and we are determined to ensure that operations there are not disrupted for all the reasons you and this committee well understand. We are closely following the developments you refer to around Hodeidah. The Secretary has spoken with Emirati leaders. He's made clear both our desire to address their security concerns and to preserve the free access to humanitarian and critical commercial supplies through that port. We are also in close touch with UN agencies and with the UN Special Envoy, Martin Griffiths, with respect to his interests and his dialogue with the Houthis.
Thank you for that. So let me ask this another way. In April, the Trump administration opposed military action undertaken by UAE and Saudi Arabia towards Hodeidah. Did that position change, or did UAE and Saudi Arabia do this despite the opposition from the Trump administration?
As the Secretary said in the statement issued by the Department, we have been in touch with the UAE leadership. We understand their security concerns, but in parallel with that understanding, we have made clear there should be no interruption of access through the ports.
Okay, let me try this a third time. Does the Trump administration support or oppose this military offensive by UAE on the port of Hodeidah?
We have been very clear with the Saudis, the Emiratis, and with Yemeni officials, all of them, at every level, that destruction of critical infrastructure, disruption of the delivery of vital humanitarian aid remains unacceptable.
All right. Follow-up question. Could you tell us how the U.S. is prioritizing UN negotiations for peace efforts in Yemen? I believe you understand, as well as the other stakeholders, that there is no military solution. What would you see as the path towards peace in Yemen?
The path towards peace in Yemen are arrangements that at first address the critical humanitarian requirements of the Yemeni people, secondly, bring down the level of violence and confrontation to the point that real negotiations amongst all of the parties involved can begin. Our understanding is that with respect to the port of Hodeidah, the UN envoy remains in the position of proposing to the Houthis resolutions which could spare threats to the port, but that the Houthis have not responded at this time to those proposals.
Thank you. Is the U.S. assisting in this military operation in Hodeidah?
No.
Okay. As you know, the State Department lawyers under the Obama administration undertook an inquiry as to whether U.S. military support for the Saudi-led coalition amounted to aiding and abetting war crimes. Can you give us a copy of that memo that the State Department lawyers wrote on that issue?
I will take your request.
All right, thank you. Can you tell us what they concluded in that memo?
Without reference to the existence or non-existence of such a specific memo, I'll take the request back.
Okay, thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. The chair now recognizes the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Connolly, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador Satterfield, the humanitarian situation in Gaza has deteriorated dramatically, doesn't even begin to describe it. It's catastrophic. 95% of water is unfit for human consumption. 53% of people live in poverty, which is up from 38% in 2011. 44% unemployment, highest recorded unemployment rate in the world. And then when we look at how it affects people's lives, 140,000 people would lack emergency food assistance if our assistance and other assistance were cut off. 42,000 patients would lack essential access to any kind of rudimentary healthcare system, let alone surgery and the like. 50,000 youths lacking access to life skills, and 12,250 people who would lose paid entrepreneurship opportunities with a freeze or an end to our assistance. What's the counter argument to that in terms of it's time to cut off assistance or run the clock on the FY17 funding levels provided by the Congress?
There is absolutely no challenge.
I can't hear you, sir.
There is no challenge from the administration to the gravity of the humanitarian suffering in Gaza.
So you agree with what I just
I agree
narrated.
with the magnitude of the humanitarian suffering. What I would note is it is an international responsibility, not solely one on the shoulders of the United States, to address the real humanitarian needs in Gaza. It is a need that the United States has disproportionately borne responsibility for many years. But I would also, sir, reflect on why the situation in Gaza is as it is. It is 11 years of governance by a terrorist organization that has chosen to use its resources, chosen to use parts of international assistance for the furtherance of its military goal, which is threatening, if not aiming for the destruction
Ambassador
of Israel.
Satterfield, American generosity has overlooked that time and time again in the post-World War II era, including, I might add, with North Korea. Even in the midst of unbelievable human rights violations in North Korea by this dictator and his father and his grandfather before it, the United States found itself providing, for example, humanitarian food assistance so that people didn't starve to death, irrespective of the politics of the regime. Do we have a different standard for the Gaza? Because you don't like Hamas. I don't like Hamas either, but there are people who are suffering, as you and I both agree.
We are making an assessment.
I'm sorry.
We are making an assessment of what U.S. assistance is appropriate for Gaza, West Bank, in conjunction with our emphasis on burden sharing by regional parties which are directly affected by this.
Ambassador Satterfield, I agree with that. I think the United States absolutely should insist on burden sharing. It shouldn't just be disproportionately our burden. I agree. And I think the objections to the Hamas government are legitimate and need to be registered. But we have to also look at the suffering of the people in the Gaza. We can't just decide because of your political structure, you're going to suffer, and we don't care. And right now, as I understand it, you've undertaken a review of our assistance to Gaza starting in January. That review began in January. Is that correct?
Yes.
Sir, it is now June. And as I understand it, you have declined to give us any timeline for when we might expect completion of that review and new policy recommendations coming out of it. And as I said, meanwhile, there's a freeze, is there not, on the assistance going to the Gaza?
Except for currently or previously obligated funds, yes, sir.
And how would you respond to the critics who say that this review is really subterfuge for, running the clock until the FY17 appropriation expires in September?
The review is at the direction of the President. It will answer ultimately to the President in terms of decision-making, and it is based upon what is the most appropriate use of U.S. taxpayer resources to affect U.S. strategic objectives wherever the review may be, Syria, Gaza, West Bank.
Well, I'm sure that will bring great comfort to the human suffering in the Gaza. I yield back.
Chair yields back. The gentleman yields back to the chair. The chair is going to recognize himself for 3 minutes. I just want to make a note to committee members. We do have a hard stop here at the committee at noon. After I recognize myself for 3 minutes, I'll be recognizing Ms. Frankel for 3 minutes and then Mr. Deutsch. And then we'll be concluding the subcommittee meeting. That's the plan. So the chair recognizes himself for 3 minutes. If we can move to the situation we're all witnessing with the protesters in Iran, and if you could just share your thoughts, your reflections on what you're seeing. A lot of people within the country are speaking out, they're protesting, there's a crackdown on the government. What are we seeing in recent weeks and months with regards to Iran?
The protests you refer to are extremely interesting because unlike the protests of previous years, they're not addressed to any particular official or any particular movement, conservative, radical, moderate. It's about the structure of economics, the structure of finance, employment, jobs, life in general in Iran. It's a broad-based, multi-city protest. The structure's rotten. It's not addressing the needs of the Iranian people. There have been bank collapses, people have been left without resources, middle class is diminishing. It's the system itself that's the object of this protest, and it may be why it's as challenging and significant as it is. There are limited resources available to the regime. We believe they have been grossly misspent in support of Iran's malign adventures in the region and beyond. The people of Iran, who may or may not have transparency on those issues, probably less rather than more, are reacting to what they see at their level, their access to economic opportunity, the reliability of a system taking care of them. That's what the generator is for this protest, and it's significant.
Since the president's decision to withdraw from the nuclear deal, what kind of response are you seeing from the Iranian regime as far as an interest in staying in or a desire to go in a different direction?
In the context of this setting, I would say that the regime is deliberating over what it does. What does it do to avoid making the situation worse, to avoid isolating itself further, to avoid alienating critical European and other trading partners more? And I don't think they've come to a specific decision. We could discuss this more in another setting.
I'm going to yield back. Thank you to the witnesses. And at this time, Mr. Curtis actually just arrived, so I'm going to recognize him now for 3 minutes.
Thank you. Appreciate everybody's time today and the witnesses being here for such a long period of time. I'd like to talk just a little bit about what's happening in Iran with several months ago, we saw the protest. The administration was very supportive of the protesters. And I'm kind of curious what we could look forward to as far as how we use our resources there to support those who need it most and who are supportive of the United States.
I think the best use of our resources to ensure that the Iranian people are as aware as possible of the decisions being taken by their regime, the adventures in which their regime is engaging in a regional context, the expenses those adventures require, and allowed to communicate amongst themselves. I think that is probably the absolute best use of our resources.
The adventures, that's an interesting term. I think we probably all know what you're talking about. Are we, and by we I mean Congress, are we doing enough, and is there something else that we can be doing?
We've had very strong support from the Congress with respect to the programs that we are undertaking in Iran, and we're very pleased with the fact that the support has been sufficient to address the needs we've identified.
Thank you. Another situation where we've got people, well-meaning people, sometimes being taken advantage of, particularly by terrorist groups, is Gaza. And can the U.S. assistance be used to improve the situation for the majority of people in Gaza that simply want to live their lives without some of those funds going to the terrorist organizations? And do you have an opinion on that?
The meta issue, if I may refer to it as such in Gaza, is that humanitarian assistance, however worthy in addressing the very real suffering of the people of Gaza, is a palliative measure. It doesn't address the core reasons why the people of Gaza are suffering, which are the choices made and the choices not made by the Hamas leadership. And there is a degree of difference between palliation and ultimately addressing root causes of a problem. There have been many, many years of measures that attempt to address today's problem, today's suffering. They haven't really gotten at the core of the problem of Gaza yet, which is Hamas.
Yes. Okay, thank you. I yield my time.
Gentleman yields back. At this time, the chair recognizes the gentlewoman from Florida, Ms. Frankel, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, and I just want to follow up on our discussion today on what's going on in Gaza, West Bank with the Palestinians. And just to preface it by saying, I know we all care about Israel's security and prosperity, and I stand with Israel. It's an enduring situation for me. But I think this is like cutting off your nose to spite your face, the attitude that you're reflecting here today. Because if you want to stop the violence from spilling out even further from Gaza, it seems to me that we have to participate in humanitarian assistance. I mean, we give, rightfully so, billions of dollars to Israel to keep them secure, and yet now you want to take away what is millions to prevent the harm that Mr. Connolly laid out here. And I just want to read from the Times of Israel today, or recently, where the IDF chief, that's Israel Defense Fund, said to warn Gaza war likely if humanitarian crisis persists. The IDF Chief of Staff, Gadi Eisenkot, warned ministers during a cabinet meeting on Sunday that Israel could soon face another war with Gaza-based terror group Hamas as a result of the deteriorating humanitarian and economic conditions in the coastal enclave. And he further said that should the humanitarian crisis continue to spiral, Israel is liable to find itself drawn into another round of fighting with Hamas in 2018. So it seems to me that this hardline attitude, as I said, is like cutting off your nose to spite your face. And I would really urge the administration to rethink its position. And I yield back.
Gentlewoman yields back. At this time, the chair would like to recognize the gentleman from Florida, Mr. Deutsch, for 3 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just I wanted to return to this topic also and see if we can just. I think it would be really helpful, Ambassador Satterfield, for the committee, in light of Mr. Connolly and Ms. Frankel have said, and others, to understand a little more detail about what this review looks like. So there is, you said the NSC is leading an interagency review. So I asked the following questions. I think we'd all like to know, to the extent you can share with us. First, what specifically is the scope of the review? Mr. Connolly pointed out how long we've been waiting. What's the timeline for completing the review? Is there a deadline by which it's going to be completed, given the humanitarian crisis that exists that is in so many ways impacting certainly those whose lives are being challenged because of the humanitarian crisis, and ultimately the security in Gaza and the security for our ally Israel. So is there a deadline? Who else is participating in that review that the NSC is leading? And then ultimately, and finally, I think most importantly, is there a guiding principle other than how much should we be contributing and how much should others be contributing? Is there a guiding principle about how the review is being conducted and what American interests are, particularly the ongoing commitment that this country has always made when there is a humanitarian crisis?
Mr. Deutsch, I'm very much aware of the interest of this committee, Mr. Connolly, Ms. Franco, and others. I will have to take the questions you have posed back for a response.
Okay. So then I just ask this follow-up. Is that a response? The NSC is somewhere when a review is conducted like this, there's a charge given. So where did that come from? How much specificity was in it? I think that's what we'd like to understand.
I understand your question. I will take that back.
Okay, I appreciate it if you can take that back, and we would very much appreciate that response be presented, provided to us in writing. I'd be happy to yield to Mr. Connolly.
I thank my friend. I just would add, if you would consent, another question, which is the one Ms. Frankel raised, which is this freeze and is this long timeline unwittingly harmful to our ally Israel? Because at some point this becomes a security threat to Israel, but for the want of humanitarian assistance, as Ms. Frankel pointed out. And I think that's a legitimate policy question to be examined and answered. I thank my friend.
And an appropriate question to be included, and I thank Mr. Connolly. I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. I'd like to thank all the members for participating, especially our witnesses today. The subcommittee stands adjourned.